In today's video, we're talking about going from this beautiful front yard that we had with our golden retriever running around to a completely different site that looked like this with our entire front yard all torn up. And it was all part of the process of replacing our HVAC, which looked like this. It was about 20 to 25 years old and definitely in need of replacement. So it wasn't surprising when it died. But we went from this to this WaterFurnace Series after our system died in August, leaving us without AC during one of the hottest months of the year. In today's video, I'm going to walk through all the different things I considered as part of my installation. I looked at a replacement for my existing natural gas furnace. I also looked at an air source heat pump version instead of a ground source heat pump. But ultimately, I decided to go with the WaterFurnace 7 as part of a ground source heat pump system. But I'm going to explain a lot of the factors I considered as part of this install and some things that you might want to consider if you're looking at possibly getting a geothermal system in the future. Now, these are the areas that we're going to talk about as part of this video here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the events that preceded or led up to the installation of my geothermal system, because I think there's some interesting aspects to the reasons why I went with the geothermal system that might resonate with your situation or might differentiate from your situation and give you some more context to think about what you want to do. And I'm also going to talk about the cost. I'm taking a look at it from the perspective of just replacing my existing system, getting an air source or a geothermal system like I ended up going with. So I'll show you the actual estimates that I received as part of this process. And I'm going to talk about the WaterFurnace Series 5 versus the Series 7, some kind of big ticket items that are some differentiating ways to look at them. I don't go through an exhaustive list of all the differences between the two systems. There are quite a few differences, just kind of the big ticket items that I considered as part of my decision making. And for example, like the variable speed, whether it's zonal architecture, the thermostat, the efficiency, that kind of stuff. And then how long does the system get warranted for? And what can you expect from a geothermal system? And then also the maintenance for the system. And I'll talk a little bit about that also. Again, I haven't had the system very long, so there'll be other videos in the future that explain my experience over time with the system. And then the issues that I encountered during the actual installs. These are really helpful depending on your situation. They might help explain what to expect or things to ask depending on where you live on how the installation might actually go. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, this is the system that we ended up replacing. Now, this system was 20 to 25 years old, and it is important to have a little bit of context for all the situation that was kind of unfolding regarding this system and then other things in our house. So we ended up installing solar in 2024 December. So right before the new year, we ended up installing the solar, and the goal was to try to get the tax credit so that when we filed our taxes in March or April, we would be able to put all that money into the solar. And then we could also take a look at doing some other upgrades that we wanted to do, of which the geothermal or HVAC replacement was one of them. A few months before we did the solar, we actually had an issue with the HVAC system where we had to recharge it in the summer. There was a small leak, and they quoted me around $7,000 or $8,000 to essentially fix the leak so that it wasn't a problem. But it's such an old system, it didn't make financial sense to put a lot of money into it. So we ended up just recharging the system. And what we were kind of hoping for is that we could kind of delay having to replace the system, because I was looking at geothermal systems even that far back, just because of the energy efficiency that a geothermal system has. So we put a lot of thought into actually just replacing it with a geothermal system as far back as 2024. But again, we just kind of recharged it, try to buy ourselves some time because they are expensive systems to install. Then we get to the new year, and actually it was right around Christmas in December of 2024, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. I can't remember exactly what day it was, but our washer machine also died. So we ended up having to replace our washing machine, which is about 10 years old. It was coming up for replacement. So again, a lot of stuff in this house needed to be replaced after we bought it a couple years ago, and we knew it. Most everything was pretty old and definitely a high risk for having to replace. But we ended up replacing our washer and dryer as a combo, and we went with a heat pump dryer, again, energy efficiency, and then a high efficiency washer to go with it. And then we actually added a refrigerator also, so we replaced basically all the big appliances in the house. We still have a gas stove, and we didn't replace the dishwasher yet, but the dishwasher is probably about 8-9 years old also, so we know that that's probably going to be in the next year or two that we're replacing that also. But no reason to replace that one before it just dies, because those are so easy to replace. But anyway, to get back on topic, that was kind of the setup for 2025. Kind of an expensive year. We just got done doing the solar. Fast forward, we did our taxes. It knocked about 30% to 50% off of the amount that I owed for the solar system. And I immediately started looking at potential replacements for this aging HVAC system, knowing again that we just bought some time, not necessarily that we bought a lot of time. I was hoping for at least 2 to 3 years, but it turns out that was not going to be how things worked out. Plus, we also had a new administration coming in, and we were hearing a lot about getting rid of the tax credits. There was 2 major upgrades that I was looking at doing that required the tax credits, or ideally I would take advantage of the tax credits, and that was going to be the geothermal system and then also adding battery to my solar package. Now, I did a video talking a lot about the solar installation. I'll put the link to that up in the right hand corner of the video, so you can go ahead and click that if you want to watch the solar installation. But that plays a heavy role in pretty much everything regarding my house and upgrades, trying to get more energy efficient and then leveraging that solar. But I wanted to take advantage of the tax credit for both geothermal and the battery. But that's a lot of money. I was figuring somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000 for the geothermal system, and I was figuring anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 for the battery system. Now, I'd get more back, obviously, from the geothermal system based off the numbers because I could get less battery or just not get battery at all. So I was leaning towards the geothermal system. In June of 2025, I reached out to the geothermal installer in my area and started getting the process of quotes and kind of figuring out the financing as early as June. In July, I contacted him and said, yep, I agree. Let's go ahead and move forward on this project. Then August rolls around and our HVAC completely dies. Just completely dies. I ended up bringing in a plumber to take a look at the system to see if we could get it back online while we're waiting for the geothermal system to be installed, because it is a lengthy process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a bit, about that process. But it is a lengthy process. And basically, everything, the condenser, the compressor, pretty much the entire system was shot. They quoted me about $9,000 to fix it. Well, since I'm putting a lot of money into the geothermal system, that just didn't make sense. So I reached out to the geothermal installer and said, hey, let's go ahead and accelerate this as much as we can. And they did work with me a little bit on to try to get us a little bit of relief for the August heat that we were experiencing in Virginia. And it wasn't terrible, especially towards the end of August, but there were some really hot days. I remember taking pictures of the house being 90 degrees. It was a miserable experience while we were waiting for the geothermal system to get installed. So that's kind of the setup on things. Now, because the system died and because I had the plumber come in, I got some quotes and I was just curious. I already agreed to the geothermal system, but I wanted to see how much would it be just to replace the existing system, and then how much would it be for an air source heat pump instead of a ground source, which is what I was going with my geothermal system. How do those prices compare? Now, the replacement system, I was quoted about $25,000 to just replace the system. It was a SEER 15 system. My current system was about a SEER 13 system, even for how old the system was. But I was only going to get a marginal increase in efficiency with a brand new system. And again, $25,000 for that system. Now, I had the same company also quote doing an air source heat pump. That ended up being around $33,000. Now, I think you'll be shocked to know how close the installation of the geothermal system with a ground source heat pump was to the installation of an air source heat pump. Now, here's my actual quote for the installation of the geothermal system. Now, as you can see here, it was $50,000. Again, in 2024, I had reached out, and back then it was $49,000. So it had gone up between 2024 and 2025. And then we've got this additional thing for the 7 series upgrade, but that's an upgrade, not necessarily a requirement. And we can see my after-tax credit quote was essentially $35,582. Only a couple $1,000s more than doing an air source, and only about $10,000 more than doing a traditional system just to replace what I already had. So it actually wasn't as expensive as you would expect a geothermal system to be. It was very comparable. Now it's 2026 and the tax credit is gone. So right now the system would be a lot more money to get it installed. So if you're thinking about doing a geothermal system, unfortunately you might not have the federal tax credit right now, but you might still have some state incentives. In Virginia, I don't have any state incentives. It was pretty much just the federal tax credit that I could take advantage of. But I was shocked to see how close a ground source heat pump was to just a traditional system or an air source heat pump. I think now's a good time to remind you to hit that like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. It really does help the channel grow and get the content to others that might like this content also. What you're looking at now, I'm going to cover this in a future video. So this is just kind of a preview of what's to come in a couple weeks. I'm going to take a look at all the upgrades I've done in my house, and I'm going to explain whether it was worth it or not. Now let's talk about the Water Series 5 versus the Water Series 7. Initially, my quote was for the Water Series 5, and I put a lot of thought into whether I should get the Water Series 5 or upgrade to the Water Series 7. You saw it was about a $4,700-ish increase. What are the big differences between a 5 series and a 7 series? Well, first of all, the 5 series is basically low and high. It's not variable speed. You're either going to be at low or you're going to be at high. It doesn't necessarily come with a soft start. You could probably add soft start, and it is a little bit of more of a soft start or an upgrade compared to what I had for my original system, but it definitely was not a soft start technology. And as we can see, it's a SEER 30 and a COP of 5. In comparison, we'll see the Series 7 here in a little bit, but the Series 7 has much better numbers, much more efficient. So essentially, Series 5, think low and high. You don't have any variability in the speed. A little bit less efficient, still much, much more efficient than what I was being quoted for an air source, which was a SEER of 19, or just replacing my natural gas furnace, which was a 15. Going from what I had, which is a 13, all the way up to a 30 is a significant improvement just on its own. But I really like the idea of a variable speed, which comes with your Series 7. Plus, the Series 7 supported zonal architecture, and I was having some issues between the upstairs and our main floor with temperature variation. So we'd have about a 10-degree swing between our upstairs and our main floor. And I was kind of hoping to put zones in to fix that, which is a lot easier with the Series 7 hardware. Now, when we look at the Series 7, we can see it's got a SEER of 47 and a COP of 5.2. So much, much better, much more efficient piece of hardware. And this has a variable speed. So essentially, I don't have the option of just low and high. Whenever the temperature needs adjustment, it's going to only provide or use as much energy as is necessary to bring the house back to the temperature that I've got set, which also means that it's not going to have a high ramp up. So it's going to be a lot less impact on a future battery system or the ability for my solar and battery to basically run this system, which is a huge factor. Again, I'm trying to build as close to an off-grid capable system as possible. So this was a huge selling point for me on why I might want to do the 7 series. When I was talking with the installation team about this, they were describing the Series 7 as thinking about it like this. It's going to run pretty much nonstop all day long, keeping my house at the temperature that I've got set, whether it's 70 degrees or 68 degrees, whatever the temperature is. It's going to run more often, but not as much energy because it's not pushing as hard. So instead of running at full speed, whatever that number happens to be, 10, 12, whatever that number is, it might only kick up to a 2 or a 3. So way less power drain, but more frequently throughout the course of the day. So my temperature curve is going to be a little bit more level, if you will, compared to a Series 5, where you might see more of a fluctuation. Plus, it's going to have that high ramp up. It's going to go into high mode and essentially use a lot of energy very quickly in order to heat or cool the house. Now, as you saw, I'm putting this in my basement, so sound wasn't a huge factor. The Series 5 was supposed to be really quiet. The Series 7 was supposed to be even more quiet. So there was, again, a lot of selling points for the Series 7 on why this made sense. Plus, ideally, I don't have to do another one of these for 15 to 20 years. Again, the warranty is about the same as your typical furnace install, but I figure I may as well put a little bit of extra money into the best technology that's out there. That way I definitely wouldn't regret having the wrong one. It came with the soft start, which is probably going to be necessary as part of the battery and the inverter install. So I was really trying to prepare for future installs as part of this as well. So one way to look at it is your Series 5 is a fantastic piece of equipment. Your Series 7 is in a completely different league. It really is that much better than pretty much anything that's on the market. And from what I could find, the Series 7 is the best geothermal system that is on the market right now. There's nothing even close. They're all around 40 from what I could tell, but the best one on the market right now is the Series 7. But if I'm wrong about that, go ahead and put a comment in the description. If there's another system that's out there that's better, let me know. I'd love to read about it because this was the best system that I found. Now, the installer that I worked with, this is the only system that they installed, so it was probably good luck that this is what I found because I was already looking at trying to get this system before I talked to the installer. Now, one thing you might be asking yourself is about the warranty, and I talked a little bit about the warranty for this. It's about the same as your typical hardware inside of your house, but the ground loop, the actual installed well portion of the system, has a 50-year warranty, at least through the company that I went with. That's one of the really big selling points for this type of system. Now, your typical system has your indoor furnace and then you got your outdoor compressor. So you got a compressor condenser type system. This one, you've got just the inside unit and the loops that are installed into the ground. Now that ground loop has a 50-year warranty, so I don't have to worry about that for 50 years. And talking to the installer, they actually think that they're going to last anywhere from 100 to 150 years before you have to do anything to replace or upkeep that part of the system. So essentially, the rest of my life, I should never have to worry about that aspect. I might eventually have to replace the Series 7 in the future, and it'll just tie in with my existing loop. Now, as far as maintenance, I don't have to really do anything. I just change the filter every 4 to 6 months. That's the only maintenance that I'm required for. Now, they do offer maintenance plans where they'll come take a look at your system periodically just to make sure that everything is working as it's supposed to. The first year is covered. The second year, you'll have to start paying for that if you want to. I suspect that most installers are set up that way. So you should see something very similar if you're to get an installation of a system like this. And I think it's the same for most HVACs that you install, regardless of what type they are these days, that they offer some sort of a maintenance plan to protect your investment. Now let's talk a little bit about the actual components of the system. So right here, we can see that we've got the heat strips. Now I live in the Northern Virginia area. It does tend to get a little chilly here. So you do want to have auxiliary heat for the off chance that you need a little bit of extra help beyond what the heat pump can actually do. So that's essentially what your heat strips do, is provide you that extra heat. It's basically electric heat that you're kicking into the system. Now it's January and it's around 20 degrees outside, and we still haven't had to use this, but this week we're expected our first negative temperatures of the year, so it's possible that I'll have to turn this on. I'll do future content on the impact of essentially this week and the next week where we have all these below zero temperatures expected, but right now I have not had to use this auxiliary emergency heat strip stuff at all. Now this component here is the ECM variable speed assembly. This is what you're actually going to hear in the system. And it's not very loud. It's actually surprising how quiet this is. And compared to my gas furnace, which would have that constant burning of natural gas, this thing is very quiet in comparison. You can actually hear yourself downstairs very easily with this. Actually, the heat pump water heater is a little bit louder than this thing is. So when the water heater's on, that's usually when you're actually kind of talking a little bit louder if you're right next to it, because it's quite a bit louder than this thing is. This thing, you can barely hear it. You can barely hear it turn on or turn off, especially if you're in other parts of the house. It is a very quiet system. And then here we've got the dual flow circulation pump. Essentially, this connects to my outside wells and all the water comes in through this into the system. So up here, we've essentially got the parts that go outdoors, and then this goes into our actual system. And here we can see the loops coming in from outdoors and then running over to the actual furnace and those circulating pumps. Now here is the WaterFurnace upgraded thermostat. This is what you get with your Series 7. I'm not sure if the Series 5 gets this version. I know there's a couple different versions of this, and this is brand new. It actually just came out around the same time that they were installing my system. It was so new when it came out, it actually still didn't work with the Series 7 that I had. So I had to wait a month or two for them to update the system for this to actually work with my system. All right, so here is the zonal architecture hardware. Now, again, I wanted zonal architecture, so we did install that. You can actually see that we've got two here. This goes upstairs, and then this one goes to a portion of our house. Then we've got a couple others as well. Now, I only went with 2 zones. I kind of wish I had more zones. We still have a temperature issue in our living space on the main floor, and that's primarily because we've got this huge open door area, and a lot of times we let the dogs in and out there, so we're essentially letting all that cold or hot air in right where we're typically sitting in the main area. It would be nice to have a little bit better temperature control in that particular area. But between the upstairs and our main floor, it's phenomenal. It's night and day difference between what we had with the natural gas furnace versus what we have now. Much more comfortable, much more consistent on the temperature, at least in the months that we've owned the system so far. If you have the money for the zonal system, I highly recommend that as an upgrade as part of your system install. It was well worth it, in my opinion, to get this. And I'm going to show you the actual data that the app shows you. And when you'll see that I've actually got the temperature upstairs set a few degrees lower than what we have it downstairs. You couldn't do that without the zonal architecture. Now the fun part. Let's talk about the actual installation process and how it worked out. Would I choose this company if I was to do it again, or would I choose a different company? What was the actual experience like? And what might happen during your installation so you can be properly prepared if those things happen to you. Now, I went with North American Geothermal. They're pretty much the only option in Northern Virginia area, and they did a great job. I would actually use them again. I wouldn't necessarily use any other company, especially if I'm doing a ground source heat pump. There might be other options out there. This is the only one that came up for me. I actually reached out to other companies, and some of those companies told me to go talk to North American Geothermal because they couldn't match the price. So they were very honest and very upfront that they don't do the geothermal installs, and then if they did, they wouldn't be able to beat the price that North American Geothermal did provide. So I called a couple of different companies. I always try to get a couple of different quotes, and pretty much everybody said the same thing, is to call these guys, which I already done. But again, I was trying to do due diligence. When you Google geothermal in my area, this is the company that pops up. There is that aspect, is there's just not a lot of installers. Maybe there's more installers where you live, but in my area, there really wasn't another option. This was pretty much the only company that you had an option to choose from. Now, because my system actually died, we had to put this rain tree in. And essentially what happened is they put in the water furnace downstairs. And while we were waiting for all the permitting to get done for the actual loop, they installed this. So essentially for about a month, we had this thing installed. And this did present some challenges. I was very grateful to have this. Not every install would necessarily need this, but again, because the length of time I was going to have to wait for the actual drilling of the well, it was kind of warm in September, so this did help. We had a couple of different problems with this system. The water hose that feeds this actually broke at one point. The connection broke, or it wore down over time. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but it ended up leaking, and I ended up using a lot of water before I caught the issue. And then typically this thing would run out at least once or twice a day or more. So this thing was constantly putting water in here. My water bill for the period of time that this thing was running was about $600. So kind of a little bit of sticker shock. Normally my water bill is anywhere from $200 to $300. $600 was a typical water bill I would have when I have to fill up my pool. So it was quite a lot of water that this thing used. Way more than they told me that it might use. So I used this thing a little bit more sparingly after I got that first $600 bill. I really only turned this thing on when I really needed to cool down the house, because it was, again, kind of warm. So I would typically turn this on during the day just to be a little bit more comfortable. Make sure that there was water in there, turn it off once it was full, and then I would check back in here about every 4 to 8 hours just to see if it needed more water, and I would add a little bit more water, and then a lot of times I would turn this off at night. So I did kind of manage the usage of this thing just to have comfort in the house, and it did run dry quite a few times, which caused faults for the system because it wasn't able to provide any water. I think they were a little bit annoyed with it, but they didn't have to pay the $600 water fee for the water this thing was using. And I did mention it to the company that, hey, this thing uses a lot of water. You might want to let people know, especially since it was pretty warm over the September, August timeframe. I think a lot of the water was just evaporating, would be my guess. But it did use quite a lot of water. Now, the actual install is incredibly messy, as you can see. Essentially, they're going down 300 plus feet in 2 different holes. So it produces a ton of dirt. And in Virginia, you can't haul your dirt away. So you're stuck with all this dirt on your property. So just keep that in mind if you're in the Virginia area. You can't haul this away, so you're stuck with it. Now, as you can see here, they're digging the well, and you got a huge truck, and it actually broke our sidewalk, even with the plywood they put down there. So this thing is massive and heavy, but it just produces a ton of dirt. And now this is the starting process. So you saw the previous video where you can see how much dirt this turned into. This is essentially the beginning of that process. And you can see that when they actually get into the position of digging the well, the front of the truck actually left the pavement. All of the weight is back here, and they've got these supports over here that are keeping it elevated essentially and level so they can dig this thing in a perpendicular line straight down essentially. But they actually broke some of the pavers right here because of the weight of this truck. It is a massive truck. And I've heard some stories where the actual sidewalks broke under the weight. I was fortunate that didn't happen in my situation, but I could see this based off of the sheer size of this truck that, yes, it's definitely possible that you could have some sidewalk damage. Ideally, what they would try to do is come up on the grass here, but because of the pitch of my front yard, it wasn't possible to get the truck up there like they would initially had planned. So they actually had to drive up through here, and it ended up tearing up the dirt both over here and coming into my yard. Now here we can start to see exactly how much dirt we're talking about. So we've got essentially a well that's been dug here, and then we've got another well that's been dug over here. So we ended up with just a ton of dirt. And then there's actually a big bladder back over here that is just filled with dirt. All of this dirt had to stay on the property. They couldn't truck any of it away. Now, this is my only complaint about the entire process is the company that actually did this is a subcontractor. They are a completely different company, so I can't blame them for this. It's kind of the best option they have in the area. They've tried other companies, and this is the one that seems to get them the best results and outcome. But they did end up telling me, yeah, we're just going to truck it all away. So it was complete fabrication. That's not actually what happened. And it was the same people that were basically handling this dirt saying this. So they knew very well when I was talking to them that they were not trucking all this stuff away. They were going to be just spreading it over my yard. And essentially it ended up raising the height of my yard in some areas by as much as 6 to 8 inches. So keep that in mind, that if your yard is already pretty high, it is going to add extra depth to your yard. And all this clay and dirt essentially is on top of my good soil from whenever they installed this house, basically covering all that up. So I've got essentially several inches of clay now on top of my ground soil. Again, just to kind of illustrate the sheer amount of mess that this is going to create when you do this kind of install on existing construction. If you're doing this as part of new construction, then you won't have necessarily these kinds of issues. But on existing, where it's an established subdivision, it is a huge mess. And it was kind of the talking point of the neighborhood. I'm the first person and only person that I'm aware of that has put a geothermal system in. So all the neighbors were very curious about what was going on. Talked with a lot of them as they were kind of just walking up and down, just kind of curious what was going on at my house. Definitely a hot topic discussion item for last year over the summer. Now in here we can actually see the hose that's put into the well. This is what runs into the house also. And again, several hundred feet going from essentially here around the side of the house and into my basement over here. And they run this down 350 to 400 feet, depends on the size of the house and the size of the system. Mine was a little over 300 feet for each of the 2 wells. Again, 2 lines going down, 2 lines in each of the different wells. And here we can kind of see what that looks like. They put these down again in the well here, and then there's another one over here. These were not as tall, but they ended up just basically fusing extensions that ran into the basement through the ground. And here we can kind of see it from the top, essentially this one over here and this one over here, and they did connect all these together eventually. Now here's a picture that kind of shows that connection. So essentially they dug down a few feet and then ran these things through. I want to say it's about 3 feet deep is how far they dug down. And as part of the process here, they actually did damage my sprinkler system. I've got a sprinkler system. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit, because that was kind of the only real issue I had with the company that did the digging portion of this, was the impact on the sprinkler system. Now here we can see the sprinkler system. Now they've already started kind of filling everything in. Now I had told them to leave it exposed so that it was very easy to see where the breaks were in the system. This break in the system was actually a little bit easier because it's right next to my sidewalk, so I could kind of remember where that was. But they actually buried everything. And I kept going out here and removing the dirt from it because I wanted to know where the breaks were. It'd make it a lot easier to find and fix after they get done filling in these holes. And they actually did a damage over here. What was funny is they were filling in all of this dirt that they kind of pulled out and kind of spread it around. And then they dug a huge hole over here later on. And they said it was to put more dirt into it. So they removed dirt just to put it all back in there. I guess it allows for more compression. I'm not sure. But when they did that, they ended up breaking the sprinkler system over here as well. And this one wasn't as obvious. Again, they buried it, and it ended up pulling the sprinkler system from over here and separating it. So we had a leak here that was harder to find because it was all buried. Now, to their credit, they did tell me they broke it over here, but again, that they buried it, which made it really, really hard to find when we had to go through and fix everything. Now, here's that sprinkler system. I went through over the weekend after they got done putting all the dirt back down and unburied this. The company that I actually contracted for the geothermal was going to come back and lay down grass seed and do some stuff. And they said they were going to fix all this. So I kind of did the work and kind of at least tried to expose most of the damage to make it a little bit easier to fix. And then I also reached out to the sprinkler installation company. It was actually installed by a previous owner, and the company that did the installation actually was bought out by an entirely different company, but they still had a lot of the information for the system. And the company actually offered to use them to do all the repairs. But because I'd already unburied a lot of this, they thought that they could handle most of this without having to have another company actually do anything. And they did. They actually did come through and fix all of this. So again, the company that did the drilling, not as good. They said that they're going to fix it. And then there was no phone calls, nothing. The owner actually came out and took a look at this because I'm sure he got a lot of phone calls and from his employees telling him that they did a pretty nasty job on my front yard. It was a real mess with the amount of dirt that they spread. It was really hard to explain it over the phone on how bad this was. I mean, it really covers the entire front lot of my yard with dirt because of how much dirt that they excavated. And unfortunately, when I was talking with the owner, he said there really isn't much you can do because you can't remove the dirt from the property. But when I explained kind of the situation here, they were definitely confused why they were digging up again over here. It doesn't really make a lot of sense that you remove dirt just to put dirt back in there. It doesn't make any sense. All they needed to do was kind of spread the dirt out, and it would have been fine. And that would have avoided all the issues associated with this portion over here entirely. Now, the biggest problem with the drilling company wasn't actually any of the sprinkler stuff, and all the sprinkler stuff over here was also messed up as part of this process. And to their credit, North American Geothermal did tell me that it's very common to mess up the sprinkler system. So this was definitely not unexpected that the sprinkler system was going to get destroyed as part of this process. Whenever you're digging wells and you're doing all this stuff on your front property and you got sprinklers, expect that you're going to have some issues. But the bigger problem is my property line is roughly right around here. You can see essentially this fence here, and then this bush kind of hides the property line. So there's a fence right there that begins where my neighbor's property is. So essentially right around here. And on day one, when we were kind of digging all this stuff out and North American Geothermal was in charge of certain aspects of it, they understood that, and they set all this stuff to kind of keep everything off of his property. And I said, you just try not to mess up my neighbor's property, because what neighbor wants their property messed up by their neighbor, right? So that's common sense, is good courtesy to not do that. Now, when they finished the process up and they were actually spreading all the dirt, all of this dirt got spread on both properties. So essentially, this right here is kind of deep right here just for the irrigation to get the water out of here. Now, we've always had some irrigation issues over here, very wet, because of all of our drainage essentially drains into here, whether it's my side, both the front and the back all drain into this area. Same for my neighbor's house, it all drains down here. So we always have a lot of issues here. It's very soggy ground, it's just constantly wet. So we typically don't walk over here just so we can keep the grass. And if you do walk over here, you have a tendency to make it look kind of like this. And actually my neighbor has a company that comes in and does his lawn, and they're constantly tearing this thing up trying to get the lawnmowers back there because it's too soggy to put the lawnmowers back there. I typically wait until it's a little bit drier, but his is on more of a scheduled thing, so sometimes it's a little wet and they kind of tear things up. But the biggest issue was they essentially spread all this dirt through this entire thing, so there's no drainage here. And his concern was valid, is that maybe all this water that would normally kind of seep into the street is going to end up in his area next to his garage, because it wasn't properly drained. You can see that his entire family was upset with this setup. They're out there taking pictures pretty much the entire day. And again, I think that's part of the reason why the owner got a lot of phone calls, is it was very obvious that the neighbor was not happy about this setup. And there wasn't much I could do, because I told everybody stay off of his property. And it seemed almost like the company was intentionally putting stuff on his property. I found a buried 2x4 on the neighbor's property, not on mine. I found some stuff on mine that was also buried, because all these, essentially these sticks, they pulled them out and then kind of buried them in the ground as they were putting all this dirt back down. So I ended up pulling a handful of these things out of the dirt, because it was very obvious they were kind of sticking out of the dirt. Again, not overly impressed with the company that was doing the drilling, because that's, again, all the drilling company was doing this portion of that. But all this dirt essentially ended up on my neighbor's property, which turned into kind of a big mess. Now, North American Geothermal, again, tried to take care of it and make everything right. So they actually came back out here and tried to make this a little bit better so that the drainage would hopefully be sufficient and the water will drain. Now, it hasn't really rained too much, and now we're in the winter side. So I don't know whether this is going to be an issue or not until probably next year. And essentially, I don't have any grass anymore because it's all covered up in dirt anyway. So it's going to be a while before I have an actual front yard that you might actually want to look at. It's pretty gnarly how bad it is right now. Now, what was the timeline? Like I said, I started the process in June. I decided to move forward in July. They installed the water furnace in essentially the end of August, early September, but we didn't actually get to the well until almost in October timeframe. So very first week in October, I believe, was when we installed everything. That took about a week to get that entire process done. The next week, we spent most of the week fixing the sprinkler system and laying down grass seed. So it was essentially mid-October when we were putting grass seed down and straw to kind of cover it up. That's a little late to spread grass seed. My theory is that most of it's not going to grow. And I talked with the company about that, and they said, no, it'll be fine. It'll look great. Trust me, it'll look great. I suspect that come February, March, April timeframe, I'm going to be reaching out to the company to say, Here's what the lawn currently looks like. It took too long to do the install. It essentially was, 4 or 5 months of install time in order to get this entire process done. Kind of a lengthy process to do. Is there anything they can do for grass seed? Now, there are some areas where I put down my own grass seed, and that actually grouped in the smaller areas. And I did put grass seed down over the entire thing. But again, I think it was just too late in the cycle for it to actually pick up. And I also put down a little bit of topsoil also to kind of help things. Again, it's just nothing but clay. I feel like a little bit of topsoil can't hurt. And then I put down some nutrients to help the grass grow. I don't think anything is going to grow just because it's kind of cold out there. And right now we're in January, so it's definitely not improving right now. But I'd say by March or April, I'll take a look at it again. And I think we're going to have to plant new seed and kind of put everything down a second time. I'm curious to see if the company will come out and do that if I send them a picture and it looks kind of the same as it did back in October. But we'll see. They were really great about everything else. Eventually, grass will grow. But I know that my neighbors aren't exactly happy that my yard's entirely messed up. We've got a couple of people that are trying to sell their house. And it's kind of hard to explain what happened over on my yard when they're driving by. So it looks like there might be some property issues in my neighborhood, especially since our houses are about 40 plus years old. It doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Hopefully, if the neighbors are selling their houses, they'll know kind of what I was doing and they can explain, hey, he was just installing a geothermal system to replace his HVAC system. Assuming that they don't have a really old HVAC system, it should end the questions there. Now, here's the Symphony platform. Now, you can still manage your system from the thermostat. You can also download the app and use the app on your phone if you want to, but you get a lot more capability by using the web browser. And it was funny, they told me that when they set up the system, but I'd completely forgotten about it for months, and then I decided to check it out. And I was very impressed with the amount of information that you can get inside of the portal. And I think they did a really good job with the setup and layout, as well as the graphics that they decided to put in here. But again, we can kind of take a look at it. We can see that the loop right now is at 33 degrees. Now, this is not in the ground. Typically, your ground is going to be around 50 degrees, and it remains pretty stable regardless what temperature is outside. Now, what this temperature is telling us is that it's doing a very good job of pulling the heat out of the water, is essentially what we're getting from this right here. And we can see that our return air is at 71 degrees. And right now it is around 18 degrees outside. And we can see down here that the forecast for the rest of this week is getting pretty chilly. There's actually a couple days where it's potentially going to be below zero. That might just be the wind chill. I'm not sure that the actual temperature is going to get there, but we can see 3 degrees is pretty cold, and it's cold enough for me. Let's go ahead and take a look at the thermostat tab. So this is essentially what your thermostat looks like. I've got it set up as black right now, but this is really what it looks like on the actual thermostat. And you saw in the picture, it looks pretty good, and it does have the color. Now, one thing about the thermostat, I had a smart thermostat. I had one of those Nest thermostats before I got this, and I spent a lot of time looking at the thermostat, adjusting things. One of the things you do with geothermals is you just leave it alone. You kind of figure out what temperature you want it at, and you set that. And there was a little bit of adjustment when I first got the system. I was trying to figure out what the temperature should be for our house. And again, it was kind of warm initially, so we set it a little bit lower. So I would say that typically in the summer, I'm going to have it around 69 or 70 degrees. And downstairs in the winter, I'm going to have a little bit warmer. As you can see, I've got it set for 73, at least in our zone 1, which is on our main zone. Our upstairs zone, I've actually got it set around 70 degrees. So there's a little bit of a difference in where I've got things set. When I have it 73 on our main level, next to that huge door I showed the picture of, it's around 69 degrees there. So I'm seeing about a 4-degree temperature difference between our living room and where the thermostat is kind of in the front of our house. So that's why I've got this temperature set a little bit warmer on our main level. Upstairs, typically I see about the same thing. I've got to do a little bit more insulation in our upstairs attic area to get a little bit better seal up there, but I've got it set at 70 degrees, and typically inside of our bedroom, it's around 68 degrees, which is perfect for sleeping. But you can actually adjust everything right here using this interface. Most of the time I just do everything from the dashboard. But if I go ahead and click the zone here, I can actually just look at zone 2, which is our upstairs, and you can kind of see how I've got things set there. And again, I might adjust things a little bit when we get to the summer again, because it was kind of at the end of the summer when we got everything actually up and running. But you've got the exact same interface here as you have on your thermostat. But you really won't miss your smart thermostat if you've already got one, because you just kind of set it and forget it. You never have to actually go in here. I rarely ever look at the information inside this app. The temperature in the house is always exactly where it should be. Let's go ahead and take a look at the energy tab over here. Now on our energy tab, I actually do come take a look at this on a fairly regular basis because I want to see what's going on. Now in August, like I said, that's when we initially installed it, but we had the rain tree set up, so we didn't actually have our loop installed. And that's the same for September here also. Now, if we look at August again, you're going to see that I actually did run the auxiliary heat. Now we've got 15 kilowatts of electrical heat as auxiliary, so we've got quite a bit. And when I turn on both, it is 15 kilowatts being run in my system. So for battery and inverter, that's good to be aware of. The inverter I ended up going with was the Solark 18K for a reason. I'm going to use 15 kilowatts every time I turn on the auxiliary heat. Now I might never turn that on. We'll see here in the next week or two with how the weather is looking, whether we actually need to use the auxiliary heat. But if I do need to turn it on, I want to make sure I have the power to actually do that. Now, on an average day without auxiliary heat, I'm usually using around 2 kilowatts. So that gives me a little bit of wiggle room if I actually need to turn the auxiliary heat on with one inverter. And then we can see as it starts getting a little bit colder outside, and again, we're towards the end of the month in January right now, but we're not actually done. But the system is using a lot more energy in the colder months. Now, I would expect in June or July, it's going to be a little bit higher also, but it just depends on how hot it is, because then we're now cooling the house. So we'll see how things look. Again, I haven't had the system very long, so we'll be doing regular update videos to kind of show how things progress using the system. Now let's go ahead and scroll and take a look at our other chart that we've got on this page. Now we've got the trending temperatures. Now we can see that rain tree that was outside. Essentially, this is how long we had it before we had the full loop installed. And we can see that the temperature of the outdoor air is kind of what drove everything right here. And then we can see that the loop after the install went down significantly. And again, it's around 50 to 55 degrees, but that's really just talking about how much heat we're taking out of the water, or out of the ground as it would be. Because the water is essentially just going down into the ground, and then the ground is what's changing the temperature of the water in the loop. And again, that's what it's signaling here. It's the entering loop temperature. And then you get your main zone temp, and you can see that it's pretty much static here all day, every single day. It really doesn't change that much. Now, there are some days where people leave the door open a little bit longer. The dogs take a little bit longer to get open. So again, those big doors have a tendency to change the temperature in the house, I think. All right, let's go back up to the top. And then you've got an alert area. Now, when I had that rain tree, this alert thing was always in there showing that I ran out of water. Since then, I have had 0 issues with the system, no alerts of any kind. Now, you can also download your data here. And then you can also see how much everything is going to cost if we just click this over, and then we'll have to put our rate per kilowatt. Now in the Virginia area, it's probably around 15 or 16 cents. So we'll go ahead and go with 15 cents and apply. So we can see here that our total energy use was about $246. Now, because I've got solar, my energy use was actually pretty close to 0. It really didn't cost me anything to heat or cool my house, which is the great thing about getting geothermal. That's why I wanted to have the most efficient system that I could afford to get, is because I can essentially heat and cool my house now with the solar that I'm producing, or the battery that I've got stored. All right, that's pretty much it for this video. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. And I'll be doing update videos on this system periodically. Definitely when we hit the 1-year mark, I'll put a video out for this as well. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm going to be talking about my overall energy use and cost. It's a little bit easier to talk about the specific impact of this system, at least in the winter months, in comparison to my natural gas system, because that's kind of an apples and oranges. I can see a very big difference. But there's all these other factors that play a little bit of a role in this, getting rid of the gas water heater and some of the other changes that we've done to the house make it a little bit harder to do. So I'm going to do a video specifically talking about all of the changes that I've made to the house in whole, and then what that impact has been on my energy utilization and the cost that I've paid for energy over the last year. So definitely check back for that video. If you turn on notifications, you get notified whenever I publish content on this channel. All right, that's it for today. Until next time.